So we've considered two different versions of the body detachment argument, both of which yield the conclusion that the mind is distinct from the body. And I want to just really emphasize that that's not to say that the mind is distinct from the body in the mere sense in which your left hand is distinct from your right, but rather that your mind is different from anything physical at all. If that argument is a sound argument, that if it's cogent and proves its conclusion, then it's going to show that a physical description of the world is not going to be a complete description of everything that's in the world. It will leave some things out. What? Well, the minds. It'll be incomplete. So Descartes, while trying to give a new rigorization of science, trying to give a mathematization of scientific theorizing, at the same time is trying to say that that will be very important and very worthwhile if we can make it work, but it's never going to be complete. It'll always leave out the capacity of minds to do the things that they do. Descartes, in another place in the sixth meditation, gives a different kind of argument for the distinctness of mind and body, for the non-physicality of the mind. It's known as the divisibility argument. Premise 1. Any piece of matter, he says, can be divided. And this is something that's a little bit controversial. It's not clear that subatomic particles can be divided, but for the sorts of matter he's able to think of and have experience with are things that he's going to say can be divided. Whereas, by contrast, many mental things cannot be divided in any sense. So, for example, suppose you've got an experience of pain in your left ankle. In what sense can that experience be divided into a left half or a right half, or a top or a bottom? That seems a kind of indivisible thing. But if that's right, then whereas matter has the modal property of being capable of being divided, mental events do not have the property of being capable of being divided. Therefore, they can't be identical. Therefore, that is to say, they're distinct in kind. So this is a different argument, perhaps not as impressive as the body detachment argument, because you can imagine someone raising questions about the idea that mental events cannot be divided at all. Likewise, you can imagine someone raising questions about the idea that all physical events can be divided. But be that as it may, for our purposes, what matters is just to notice that Descartes gives more than one argument for the distinctness of mind and body, and at least one of them has some cogency to it in such a way as to make us have to scratch our heads to think of where it might go wrong. That is, many of us take it as self-evident, or at least awfully plausible, given the recent developments in fields like neuroscience, that thinking is a phenomenon that occurs in the central nervous system. But just because we think that that's self-evident, that's not going to show us or explain to us where Descartes' argument or arguments go wrong. We'll have to dig a little bit deeper. I should also mention that by the end of the sixth meditation, Descartes looks back and says, well, I've given you the idea of clear and distinct perception. I've shown you what I take to be things that I can really establish. That is, that I have a mind, that I exist, what the contents of my mind are, second-order thoughts, the existence of God, the fact that I'm not identical, the self is not identical with anything physical. That's a fairly substantial number of things to have established with what it takes to be absolute certainty. But he also points out, he also at least remarks that, as he puts it, the hyperbolic doubts of the last few days ought to be rejected as ludicrous, including, he says, I can be sure, after all, that I'm not dreaming. How does he know this? Well, he says, dreams generally are incoherent. They're kind of illogical. They tend to not make any sense, whereas my normal waking life is not like that. My normal waking life is one that tends to have a fairly rational progression, tends to be intelligible. Therefore, I can be sure that I'm not dreaming. This is a remark that has left many commentators not quite satisfied. Many people have looked back on Descartes' meditations and said, well, I'm not sure that he succeeds in establishing the existence of God. I'm not sure, therefore, that a lot of his other argumentation is quite persuasive and quite completely cogent. And some people have gone so far as to argue that, in a sense, Descartes has let the skeptical genie out of the box. That is, if after raising this radical skepticism in the first couple of meditations, he's not quite able to completely overcome the radical doubts that he had raised. There's going to be at least some work to do to explain how all those radical doubts can be allayed, especially if you're not sure that you're convinced of the arguments for theism, the clear and distinct perception, related notions that flow from it.